Hello and welcome to the Spectator's Alternative Conference. If you've been with us all day, welcome back. If this is your first panel, you're in for a great one. Today we're going to be discussing the government's new obesity strategy, or the revival of it. The title of this panel is "The Nanny State Crusade: Is the War on Obesity the Tip of the Iceberg?" The headline partner for today's panel is the Institute of Economic Affairs. The panel was organized by the think tank. It's been wonderful to have some of Britain's leading think tanks joining us for our alternative conference. I'm Kate Andrews, economics correspondent at The Spectator, and delighted to chair this event. So I thought I'd kick off by taking a quote from a Telegraph column from 2004, which reads, "Face it, it's your own fault you're fat." That was penned by now Prime Minister Boris Johnson. It's all your own fault you're fat, to be very specific there. How far we've come. We now have a rather libertarian Prime Minister once upon a time, reasserting the obesity strategy in the wake of COVID-19, hoping to get the public into better shape. This could include a ban on TV and online adverts for high in fat, food high in fat and sugar and salt before 9 p.m. End of deals like buy one, get one free on unhealthy food. I'm sure Snowdon will talk to us about the definition of unhealthy food soon. But I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Brine MP, Member of Parliament for Winchester, Christopher Snowdon, Head of Lifestyle Economics at the IEA, Dolly Theis, co-founder of 50/50 Parliament, and Joanna Williams, founder of CIEO. Huge thanks to all of you for joining us. We're going to rattle through some opening remarks, 2 to 3 minutes each, so we can go straight to questions. I'll probably abuse my position as chair to ask a few, but we'd love to get questions from the audience. You can submit them on Spectator TV. They'll come straight to me and I'll put them to our panel. Brine, let's start with you.
Thanks, Kate. Well, thanks very much for doing this. Thanks for asking me. Thanks for the Spectator and the IEA for organising it. I was an MP for Winchester, as you say. I also was Public Health Minister from 2017 to mid 2019. So I guess the context of this event, and I mean, I'm not sure when this event was dreamt up with this title, but the context of it, like everything, has to come in the context of coronavirus. And when I used to sit in the tea room here in the House of Commons and get some questions or some raised eyebrows even from some of my colleagues about some of our so-called nanny state initiatives, nobody could have dreamt that we would have a government that was imposing such restrictions on our freedoms. That makes my version of the nanny state look rather tame. I mean, so obesity seems to be the issue that has sparked the ire, if you like, of this event and what prompted it. So why was I moved in office to do some of the things that I did and propose some of the things that I proposed, and subsequent administrations, including those who've had, as you say, with Boris Johnson, a rather Damascene conversion to this particular agenda. This is somebody who ran for the leadership of my party, describing the sugar tax as sin taxes. So, I mean, look, I would say this, that nobody wants to see people deprived of the foods they love. And we've all obviously got a right to make our own decisions about what we eat, what we drink, what we put into our body. But the fact remains, obesity is a huge problem in this country, particularly for children. 1 in 3 children are now overweight or obese by the time they leave primary school. We've got some of the highest levels of obesity in Europe. And, worryingly, the amount of more morbidly obese children is also on the rise, as is type 2 diabetes in kids. So, we're putting young people at risk of developing dangerous chronic conditions that could take years off their life. And I always felt that, and clearly so do many of my colleagues now, that it would be rather unforgivable not to act. I mean, just to touch on the diabetes point, I mean, the NHS spends about £10 billion a year on diabetes. That's just under 10% of its entire budget. So about 90% of people with diabetes have got the type 2, and we know that obesity is responsible for the vast majority of someone's risk of developing type 2. So, and we have some very high profile examples of people who have delayed or turned around their type 2 diabetes through turning around their weight management. So I would suggest that on diabetes, it's critically important. On cancer, I mean, I never knew this until I was the public health minister, but I mean, being overweight and obese is the biggest preventable cause of cancer after smoking in the UK. So, a child who is obese is obviously more likely to be so as an adult. So if we act early and change their behavior, then we prevent them from a lifetime of avoidable ill health and disease. And then just finally on COVID, we know that obesity has been widely recognised as a leading risk factor for people with severe illness. Almost about 3/4 of people in critical care with COVID are living with being overweight or obese. So I would suggest that events have borne out our desire to act. And whether the act that I tried to do and some of the stuff I proposed and some of the stuff that Johnson government has taken on with the launch of its obesity strategy, was it last month? No, it was the end of July now. I don't know, and that's to be debated. I don't think on its own it will. There is much more that needs to be done. As far as what next, to the title of your debate, I don't see it as a set course. I don't necessarily see it as a prescription for more nanny state in every single area. But if you want 3 areas where you could go next, I would suggest smoking. I would suggest alcohol, so our old favourite cigarettes and alcohol, plus the very early years agenda, which is something that Andrea Leadsom is working on here in Parliament on behalf of the Prime Minister. And you could well see more nanny state, if you want to call it that. But one woman's nanny state is another person's interventionism, and I would defend action.
Thanks, Steve. Over to Joanna.
Thank you. So I agree with Steve that if we compare where we are today to 6 months ago, it would be absolutely unthinkable that the government would be mandating 10 o'clock closing time for pubs, mask wearing in shops, how many people we can meet with in public, in private, struggling to work out whether we're allowed to mingle if we bump into our friends when we're walking down the high street. It just seems like who we can have sex with, whether students will be allowed home for Christmas or not. So the answer to the question, is obesity just the tip of the iceberg? I think it absolutely is, because over the past 6 months, we've seen that when it comes to protecting the nation's health, there is absolutely no length the government is not prepared to go to. It's prepared to intervene in all areas of our lives. Now, what I would like to argue is that this intervention, call it intervention or call it nanny statism, actually creates health problems. It doesn't lead to any solution whatsoever. And I think it's really interesting data that's just coming out today that shows that areas that have been under the most strict local lockdowns, not shown, apart from one area, there is no reduction compared to the rest of the country in cases of coronavirus. These lockdowns have been ineffective because people are breaking the rules, essentially. And I'm not saying that to berate people. I'm saying there's something about human nature when confronted by all these restrictions and regulations. And to answer the question why I think this, I want to just give a very, very quick quote from my favorite philosopher, Immanuel Kant. He says that laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large part of mankind gladly remains minors all their lives. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet, then I have no need to think. Man becomes incapable of using his own understanding because he is never permitted to try it. To throw off this immaturity, we need only freedom. Freedom to make public use of our own reason in all matters. And I think this freedom is what we're not being allowed in matters of our own health right now, or in relation to obesity. smoking and alcohol consumption for a very, very long time. And I think it's only with this freedom that we can actually, as mature adults, reach decisions for ourselves. And I think this is so important because, as Steve illustrates, when we hand responsibility for our health over to health professionals and government ministers, they have very different concerns to us. Their concerns are driven by life expectancy, keeping people alive for as long as possible, and money. How much is this costing the NHS? Whereas when you actually talk to people, their concerns are far more to do with quality of life rather than quantity of life. Yes, people want to live for a long time, but people want to be able to see their relatives. People want to be able to see their children at Christmas time. It's not just about staying alive to be locked down in isolation on your own at home all day, never going out, never seeing another person. For many people, that's simply not a life worth living. And I think the same is actually true of food as well. Food and nourishment's not simply about keeping us alive, sustaining us. For me, food is a real source of pleasure, and it makes me happy to eat nice, fatty food, whether it's healthy or not.
Thanks, Joanna. Over to Dolly.
Thanks so much. I would also agree. I love delicious food, but I will get on to that. I want to start. It's so interesting that people think that or associate Boris as a libertarian. I would like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that he introduced a sugar levy in City Hall before the government did. So he's had multiple kind of guises when it comes to intervention previously, and going actually way beyond prior to that. But anyway, I'm going to make sort of some of the more I'm being asked if I want my video, but it will start to pack up if I if I use it. I'm gonna start on some of the kind of more inline points with what's been said before, and then go on to something that I hope will be of interest to today's audience. But broadly, my view is if given the choice, most people would probably choose to be fit and well rather than unfit and unwell. But it isn't always easy to be so, and we don't always do the stuff that makes that happen, whether that's, losing weight, all the obvious stuff, drinking a bit less, giving up smoking, being more physically active. We kind of know what we need to do to achieve these things, but we don't always do it, even when the opportunity is there. So, if you can buy healthier foods, or if you technically can go for a run, why is it that we don't do it? So that leaves the questions of why don't we do this, especially if we aspire to be in, better shape of health or whatever it is, and what can be done to make it easier. And I'm basically fascinated by this, and I'm fascinated enough to be spending my kind of life at the moment researching it. And ultimately, what I want is for it just to be easy for everyone, regardless of circumstance and other things going on in our lives, to live a healthier life without having really to think about it too much, and without it taking away meaningful choice. So if that is enjoying fatty foods or whatever, I'm definitely not interested in banning that kind of stuff. But I'm interested in a world where it makes it very easy without us having to think about it, essentially. And we currently live in a world where we are disproportionately bombarded by the kind of unhealthier options, and don't always have a healthier option available to hand at the same time as we're told we should be losing weight. And I thought my colleague recently put it very well. She said, irrespective of how much education, encouragement and motivation we give people to eat better, it is very hard to make healthier choices in a context constantly sending the opposite message. Whether that's the fact that, fewer than 5% of adverts are for fruit and veg, or almost 60% of food adverts seen by kids online are for junk food. Is this sending a message that these things are treats when they make over half our TV adverts, for example? So again, coming back to what Joanna was saying, it is important to make the point that healthier food doesn't mean disgusting food or boring food. I love food and would be very sad if I lived on a, carrot stick diet. I certainly am not calling for that either. And actually it links to a point of reformulation that I've got views on that aren't necessarily what people might expect from someone working in public health. But, overly focusing on reformulated food to the point where it's disgusting is definitely not in my interest. But basically, I love delicious food, and recently took a train that made me think about how hard it is to sometimes find healthy, delicious food. When I had a couple of stop-offs and tried to find some food en route, and literally all I could find were very sad looking beige sandwiches, and otherwise it was the obvious crisps or chocolate, and I'd have to eat a lot of them to feel full. So I basically just want a world, as I said, where it's easy to be fit and well without having to think about it too much, and where of course we can enjoy treats, but where these so-called treats aren't much more easily available than the delicious, hopefully delicious alternatives that are healthier. But the question I wanted to come on to for this event in particular, and I'd be really interested to hear, if we have enough time, other people's thoughts on it, but the research I'm doing at the moment is related to the question of who is responsible. And I would agree broadly, I assume with people here, that in an ideal world, the government would never have to intervene on this stuff because it would just be easy to be active and to eat well. But when that isn't happening, or isn't happening for enough people, what options do we have? We can tell businesses and sectors like schools to make change as people, or as communities or whatever. But if they don't, then that's where government tends to feel pushed to make this happen, or it certainly justifies its action to intervene, i.e. introduce regulation, legislation on these sorts of things. And focusing on self-regulation, I've been recently analysing government obesity policies and have found that the vast majority of policies are, I will be promise you this is the last point, are proposed in a way that doesn't readily lead to implementation. So even when they're not, laws or regulations of any sort, but they're indications of what should be done, they're proposed in such an unclear and undetailed way, or a way that doesn't necessarily allow the sector to implement that they are unlikely to then happen. So no wonder we end up in a position where the government thinks, what else is there to do but to intervene? And that's what I find very frustrating, is I think that we probably could have a lot more agreement, i.e. the people that are slightly less offended by intervention and those who are, where we, if policies were proposed, if actions were thought through in a way that readily leads to implementation, then maybe we wouldn't need to resort to government intervention on such a kind of a regulatory scale. So I will leave it there, and thank you for having me.
Thanks, Dolly. Over to Chris.
Thanks, Kate. Well, so the question is this the tip of the iceberg? Well, obviously not. I mean, this is not the start of the slippery slope. We're well down the slippery slope. I mean, the government is on the brink of banning the advertising of cheese before 9 p.m. If you make jam or pies or something, you'll never be able to advertise your wares at all on the internet anytime, day or night. Now, this clearly is not entry-level nanny statism. This is something that's been worked on and honed for decades. Starting with smokers. Smokers have traditionally borne the brunt of most of the nanny state policies in this country over the last 15, 20 years. And as many people predicted, it's now everybody else's turn, whether they drink alcohol or they gamble or they want to eat various types of food. And it doesn't seem to matter who you vote for. It just carries on. I mean, Boris Johnson, as Dolly's already suggested, actually has never done anything libertarian. I don't know where he gets his reputation from, his newspaper articles, I suppose. He's never actually done anything libertarian. This year, he's done the least libertarian thing any prime minister has ever done. So it doesn't seem to matter who you vote for. And none of this stuff seems to be based on any kind of liberal or conservative principles, or indeed socialist principles. It's based primarily on opportunism. It's based on a groundswell of agitation from various pressure groups, which politicians, for some reason, just seem unable or unwilling to ignore. But at the root of it is a basic coercive paternalism, which in my view is simply antisocial. It is rooted, for all the excuses that you hear about, the cost of the NHS, or the clearly fake statistics, like the idea that 1 in 3 11-year-olds is overweight or obese, which is, if you look into how the statistics are created, it will blow your mind. For all the various excuses people come up with, at the root of it is the desire to stop people doing things that they don't like. That's what it comes down to. It goes really back to Blair. I think Blair kind of he kind of normalized the idea that if you don't like something, you can ban it. And that's continued on now for over 20 years. And in a liberal society, that should be considered an antisocial position. And unfortunately, it's not. And for that reason, the slippery slope has become a runaway train, and I don't see any end in sight.
Dolly and Chris make a decent point there. The Spectator looked at some of his old columns when this obesity strategy was announced and brought forward again. And yes, he does pen a lot of libertarian ideas, push back on obesity strategies, smoking bans, even compulsory child car seats. But I suppose putting it into action is another story. Steve, on that point, though, is there any real evidence that this obesity strategy is going to make a meaningful difference? Can we point to any evidence in the world? I argue it's hard to find it in the UK, but even in the world, that suggests that these kinds of advertising bans are going to make the real difference. Do you not have the concern that this is just the first step, and soon more restrictions on people's liberties will come into play?
Well, look, what I would say is that, in answer to what Chris is saying and what you're saying, is that it seems to be it's a bit like the anti-vaxxers or the people in Trafalgar Square on the weekend who are sort of saying, we don't want this imposition on our lives. You know what? I don't want it either. But I didn't create a virus that's killed nearly a million people worldwide. And I would argue that in a publicly funded health service, we not only have a duty, but we have a responsibility to act. We're not making this up to be beastly to you. There are plenty of people in the food and drink industry who don't think very much of us doing things to curtail their right to advertise Domino pizzas during the X Factor. But I'm sorry, they're not good for you. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they're not good for you. In answer to your question, Kate, do I think that this obesity strategy the governor brought out, and I wrote some of it we consulted on 2 years ago. It was then got lost in the craziness of the May government and Brexit and a general election, and has now been reheated. Do I think that on its own is going to make a significant difference and move the dial? Absolutely not. No, I don't. That's why I mentioned early on in my remarks about the early years agenda and about how we actually teach young people about what is healthy about what they put into their bodies and what is healthy about the exercise they do to take the calories out. We don't want people trudging around in unhappiness, but we do want people to lead healthy lifestyles. And when you have a publicly funded health service, I think you have a responsibility to make sure that happens, because ultimately, we heard mention of the war on smoking. Honestly, given how many people in this world smoking has killed, are we seriously suggesting that it wasn't a right public health measure to try and discourage, educate, and steer people away from smoking? I'm sorry, it's just utter nonsense of a sort of grumpy centre-right view of the world, which is that we can just step back and let everybody be. That's what led to the herd mentality view around COVID, which thank goodness we didn't listen to.
Joanna, on this point about the National Health Service, if you do have a health body that is publicly funded as well as publicly run, at some point, there's going to have to be a crackdown on the way that people live their lives, because if everybody decides to make decisions that could put them in a detrimental health position, we're not going to be able to take care of them, let alone healthier people who are coming in for other ailments.
I think what Steve's saying there and his continual retorts to the fact that we've got a publicly funded health service, so we all better behave.
Well, we do, Jo.
I think, but sorry, if I can just finish my point, Steve. I think it's really interesting because up until 6 months ago, the NHS was always there to look after us if we got sick. The NHS protected the population. Something's really changed over the past 6 months. Now we are supposed to protect the NHS. We are supposed to change how we lead our lives and how we conduct ourselves in order to protect the NHS. Now that's completely, utterly bizarre. And we are not going to hospital when we're suffering from heart pains, not going to the doctors when we detect a lump, not taking our children to accident and emergency, because we're so worried about putting a strain on this publicly funded NHS that's supposed to be about protecting us. I'm not sure if it was a Freudian slip, Steve, but I noticed you were talking at the end there about this was how we got to people talking about herd mentality in relation to coronavirus. Now, my understanding is that nobody ever talked about herd mentality. People talked about herd immunity, which is a reasonable scientific proposition in relation to coronavirus. But I think herd mentality it's very interesting for how lots of MPs seem to see the population nowadays as a herd that needs managing and berating and being told what to do for the purposes of the economy and to protect the NHS. Frankly, I find it quite insulting.
I'm going to move on to Dolly and get back specifically to the topic of obesity, although points taken, Joanna. Dolly, when we're talking about obesity stats, we very often look at people as a drain on the healthcare resources that we have. But of course, these are individuals, and the vast majority of adults are in a position to make their own choices. I think it's hard to argue in the UK that people are undereducated on this issue. So at what point do you say that people have actually decided to make a choice, and it might not be the one that you would make, but people should be allowed to consume what they want as long as they're not harming anybody else?
Yeah, so I mean, it is the kind of crux on this issue. It's about what it means to make a choice, and again, this is where it's fascinating in terms of short, medium, long-term outcomes. You know, we all make choices depending on our surroundings, and they may not necessarily be compatible with, say, longer-term outcomes. So we can say that we would love to, you know, get a six-pack, and then lo and behold, I'm not doing the exercise. That is a very real reality. But my point is more just it always comes across as a very kind of extreme view when we're talking about things in relation to obesity policy, and that's why I try and really emphasize my point earlier about just making it easier. It's really not sort of pointing fingers and making people feel guilty, and you know, and this links into a lot of the problem with the framing side of things, is it's linked very much to aesthetic and fat shaming, which I know that a lot of the kind of charities focus much more on. And really, I kind of want to move away from that and away from the weight obsession. And ideally, we would just be talking about how easy it is for anyone, regardless of your circumstance, who you are, what opportunities you have. Forget education, you know, we know what we need to be doing. It doesn't necessarily, you know, make it happen for us if it's not easy in our context. And I think that's where my colleague's quote that I read out earlier about, irrespective of how much education, encouragement and motivation we give people to make these choices, if it's not conducive in your context, then it's bloody difficult. And I think everyone can you know, kind of think of experiences in their own life where it's not always, you don't always sort of are able to kind of make happen what you would like to happen because of various things. It's not to say that we're stupid or anything. I'm talking literally from my own experience. It's not always easy. And that train journey I give as an example, because as much as I would like to have eaten something healthier and made that choice, because it wasn't there, a proper choice, you know, choice that we can all agree on, I ended up eating nothing because I didn't really want to go down the crisp and chocolate route. So I'm asking for proper choice, and one where, you know, treats aren't so much more available or even the only option. So real choice, and I hope that would be something that we would all aspire towards.
Absolutely.
Chris, if we go back to before the COVID crisis and these new restrictions on our liberties, Britain is a pretty free country. I mean, very, very free. Is banning advertisements around certain kinds of junk food really the end of the world? Is that the hill to die on when it comes to an obesity strategy or the nanny state more broadly? Is it really fair to say that restrictions on ads, certainly before 9 p.m., not even banning them altogether, is truly a slippery slope? Is that really the end of liberty?
No, of course not. It's all incremental. They wouldn't get away with it if they said what they wanted to do up front. They have to do it salami slice style. This is exactly the debate they had in the 1960s. Well, we're only banning TV advertising before 9 o'clock. What's so bad about that? Now you look at the way smokers are basically second-class citizens because we've seen 50 years of incremental movement on this. I expect exactly the same thing to happen to people who want to enjoy fatty or sugary foods in the future. Why not? The logic dictates that that's where you go. Eventually you will see these food products in plain packaging, because why wouldn't you? The logic inevitably, I think, drives you to that. Just to go back to this cost to the NHS thing, if I may, very quickly. You heard this excuse with smokers. The reality is it's the aging society which is putting huge burdens on the NHS. Fat people pay taxes, for one thing. And for another thing, they would only die of something else if they were not fat. Okay, you can't just use the half truth that there are costs associated with obesity or smoking without looking at what the cost would have been had they never smoked or become obese. This is an excuse. It's what I was saying before. People will come up with all sorts of excuses to justify what is basically prejudice and paternalism.
Hey, I would.
Sorry, Steve, very quickly. This is a short panel, but I'm going to let you come back. I just want to, we're going to wrap up. So I want to go around and have each of you make a closing remark. The question I would put to you is, what would you like to see instead? Well, perhaps you want to see exactly the status quo, but ideally from your perspective, what should the government be doing or not doing in order to tackle obesity? And you can answer that how you wish. You each have 30 seconds. Steve, go ahead.
Look, the government can and it should play a role, I would suggest, in shaping an environment that supports everyone to be healthy. You know, it's much harder for families to be healthy when unhealthy food is cheaper than healthy food, the point that Dolly made. And takeaways are on every corner on the run up to schools, and oversized portions of the norm. And every time we switch on the TV or go online, we're bombarded by advertisements for unhealthy food types and burgers and chips. You know, I don't think it's nanny state to want the population to be protected from an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and now complications from COVID-19. I think that's the actions of a responsible government. We've seen the impact of government legislation with things like the soft drinks levy, the sugar tax, which led to a dramatic reduction of sugar content in soft drinks. And I'm very proud that I was part of the government that brought that in. You know, proposed action that we've taken in the rest of the plan on its own, as I've said, even the 9 p.m. watershed and junk food adverts and the bog offs at the supermarket counters, none of that on its own is going to turn around this super tanker. But we have a responsibility to tackle ill health in a population, in a publicly funded health service, and I don't think a Conservative government or any government should make an apology for that. And I would end by saying this: when you say, well, it doesn't matter who you vote for, it's always the same outcome. Well, then maybe that spans different parties and different governments, and maybe that suggests that there's a consensus here. And you know what? If you don't like what we're doing, vote us out.
Joanna?
I think the government and previous governments and future governments need to stop imposing restrictions on us, stop telling us how to live our lives, whether that's through direct impositions and rules and bans, or whether it's through nudge, things like calorie counts on menus and all the different ways in which government tries to manipulate us and get us to behave in particular ways. I think just stop, let people learn how to take responsibility for their own lives and make their own decisions. It seems to me, when I've looked at health statistics, that one of the biggest correlations with ill health, particularly ill health that comes about from lifestyle factors, is poverty. And unfortunately, if you drop bog off deals in the absence of bringing about major economic investment and improving people's employment opportunities and raising people's income levels, you're actually going further in impoverishing the nation. You make the single mum who lives on a council estate, who has very little money, you give her fewer choices when you remove the bog off deals, and you don't suddenly make her think, oh great, I'll buy £3 of carrots. You just make her be able to afford less. You make people poorer, and it's that poverty that has far worse outcomes for people's health in the long run.
Dolly?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think we agree on meaningful choice and basically striving towards that. And for me, I will repeat one more time on wanting it just to be easier, regardless of circumstance and other things going on in our lives, to live a healthy life without having to think about it too much and without having to take away any meaningful choice. But my really big push when it comes to actually the specific question in a policy context is I would love if government obesity policy was proposed in a way that was conducive to implementation, or at least scrutiny. That it's so rarely, if you look at this strategy, the fascinating thing is they've got a number of policies that are proposed and there is a bit more detail, and then right at the bottom it says it recognizes that that won't be sufficient, and then just bullet point lists other actions, and they're literally one line each. Is that a policy? You know, how do we even follow up if that's going to happen? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? How much is it going to cost? All, you know, what the evidence behind it is. absolutely proposed with nothing like that, just one sentence, and that for me is just poor policy. So I would love it if obesity policy, in fact all government policy, was proposed in a much more conducive way to implementation, or at least scrutiny.
And Chris?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry Dolly wasn't able to get a salad on a train, but I don't think it's really a good example of
I
the
want
kind
a
of.
salad, Chris.
You didn't want salad. You didn't eat anything at all in the end, so maybe that was a good obesity strategy from the train. But that's not typical of the way people buy food. If you go into the supermarket, the first thing you see is loads of fruit and veg. It's extremely cheap. The healthy choice actually is usually cheaper, and you generally as convenient as a so-called unhealthy choice. It's always cheaper to drink water than fizzy drinks. It's always cheaper to not smoke than smoke. It's always cheaper to drink soft drinks rather than alcoholic drinks. When public health people say they want to make the healthier choices easier, in practice, when you look at the policies, it's about making the so-called unhealthy choices more inconvenient, more expensive, which has the effect on people on low incomes in particular that Joanna's already mentioned. It's all destructive. If it was more constructive, they genuinely were making the healthy choices easier, then I would be much more supportive, but they're not.
Well, that was a fantastic panel. I'm not sure we came to consensus, but I think we did our very best. Dolly, Steve, Joanna, and Chris, thank you for talking through those ideas with us on Spectator TV today. For those of you who are planning on tuning into the next panel, you have about 10 minutes to get a drink of water or a glass of wine, as Chris is doing, and come back to see Fraser Nelson interview Kenny Badenoch, one of the Equalities Ministers. And we also are doing a whole host of panels tomorrow and Wednesday as well. But for now, a big thanks to our panel. I'm sorry we can't thank you in the usual way. I'm sure people are applauding at home. And a big thanks to the Institute for Economic Affairs for arranging it. Have a great day.